We now go on to the 10-minute rule motion, and I call Miss Julie Minns.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the provision of audio and tactile measures at polling stations for the purpose of enabling blind voters to vote independently and in secret, to require the Secretary of State to take steps to identify, develop and implement new accessible voting solutions for blind voters, to require the Secretary of State to undertake a review of the arrangements for postal voting in respect of accessibility for blind voters and to implement any recommendations of that review and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that I first began work on in the 1990s. Now, sadly, I am not so young for that work to have been a school project, but rather an excellent campaign led by the disability charity Scope, for whom I had the privilege of working for at that time. Scope's Polls Apart report on the 1997 general election shone a light on the many different ways disabled people were denied their democratic right to vote. From archaic medical approvals for postal voting to steps at polling stations, the barriers to voting and everyday life were and remain very real. The Polls Apart report that I co-authored with my then colleagues Jane Enticott and Nikki Philpott, and informed by the excellent campaigning work of Olivia Marks-Waldman, made a number of recommendations for reform. Indeed, the former member for Nottingham East, Mr John Heppell, presented a 10-minute rule bill, the Disability Discrimination Provision of Voting Facilities, that sought to enact many of Polls Apart's recommendations. What that report found was that a staggering 94% of polling stations surveyed on the day of the 97 general election were inaccessible to disabled people who wanted to vote independently. This led to some being unable to vote entirely, whilst others physically injured themselves trying to open impossibly heavy doors or navigate gates designed without thought for wheelchair users, all in pursuit of trying to cast their right to vote. The report called on the government to review legislation for disabled people and to review Home Office guidance to returning officers with a view to removing the barriers that prevented disabled people from exercising their right to vote independently and in secret. A right that has been enshrined for over 150 years since the Ballot Act of 1872. I am proud of the work that I did for Scope all those years ago, and I would genuinely love to stand before the House today and tell you that all of the issues we identified have been rectified. And many were, but nearly 3 decades on, too many remain. John, in my constituency of Carlisle, has glaucoma, and like many partially sighted people, had difficulty casting his vote in secret at last year's general election. With his guide dog, John headed to the polling station on the 4th of July, where staff escorted him to the booth and read aloud the candidates' names. Because for those who cannot see a ballot paper, it is impossible to read and mark one independently. And with no tactile device provided to enable John to read the ballot paper, he asked the clerk to fold it between the candidates' names and used the fold creases as a guide, relying on his memory to select his preferred candidate. Now, at first glance, this might seem like an adequate workaround, but we must ask ourselves, why should voters with sight loss, like John, have to settle for a situation where they cannot guarantee the privacy or accuracy of their vote, and where solutions are available? John's experience is not an aberration. Across the country, blind and partially sighted voters are still confronted with barriers to voting independently. RNIB's Turned Out report on the 2024 general election revealed that just a quarter of blind and partially sighted people felt the current system allowed them to vote independently and in secret. That same report also found that only half of blind and partially sighted people were satisfied with their voting experience, and 73% didn't know they could request reasonable adjustments at their local polling station. Many blind voters struggle to get the information they need in an accessible format, forcing them to either tell another person their vote or remain disenfranchised. Blind voters report feeling humiliated and let down by the system, having to share their vote out loud in public, and in some cases, not being certain who they voted for. Our democracy is all the poorer for this. That is why this bill seeks to ensure all voters with sight loss are consistently able to access information about the election and candidates independently. And then, when voting, they can, and without assistance, review candidates on the ballot paper, reliably find and mark their chosen candidate, and be in sole control of the secrecy of their vote. This isn't something that is out of reach. Technology exists and the solutions are low cost and effective. For example, tactile overlays that are placed on top of the ballot and combined with an audio recording of the candidate list allows blind voters to easily navigate and mark the ballot paper with autonomy, dignity and certainty. In a recent UK trial, audio and tactile accessible voting solutions enabled 93% of participants to vote independently and in secret. Currently, however, these modest solutions are not routinely available at our polling stations. As it is, the law puts the onus on the blind and partially sighted person to pre-book their vote by making contact with the electoral authorities and requesting specific adaptations, requests that may or may not be granted. The vast majority of blind and partially sighted people do not know these provisions exist or what adaptations to request. The barriers facing voters with sight loss also extend beyond the polling station. That's why this bill also calls for a review of our postal voting system, which many blind voters feel pushed towards because of the inaccessibility of polling stations. However, the same issues around independence and privacy are present. 68% of blind postal voters told RNIB they had assistance from another person to enable them to vote. One respondent told RNIB, "I avoid voting in person because my local polling station doesn't have a clue what to do with me. Now I use postal voting, but I have to rely on my partner completing my form for me, so it's not confidential, and nor can I guarantee they tick the box I ask them to. I just have to trust them." While voting in this country continues to rely on an inaccessible paper-based system, in Australia they have introduced a human-assisted telephone voting model, where a blind or partially sighted person can pre-register so that on the day of the election they can vote over the phone, anonymously and in secret. Reflecting best practice from other countries, this bill demands a proactive and accelerated approach to tackling the barriers to voting that disabled people face. This bill is ultimately a recognition that elections can and must be made accessible to everyone. An accessible voting system is essential for the health of our democracy, and this bill is a vital step to correcting an injustice and building a democracy where voters like John are not left behind. I urge the House to support this bill.
Yeah. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of their opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Steve Darling, Jim Shannon, Mims Davis, Neil Duncan Jordan, Paul Davis, Liam Conlon, Katrina Murray, Irene Campbell, James Naish, Lee Pitcher, Deirdre Costigan and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Miss Julie Minns. Keep it straight now, nice and straight.
Elections, Accessibility for Blind Voters Bill.
Second reading what day?
March 28th.
March 28th. March 28th.